one of the most difficult steps from some people's perspective is principle 6 and step 8. This is where we're coming to that place of surveying the damage and taking that in and seeing the costs and how that's impacted ourselves, how it's impacted others, and what does that look like to move to a space of making amends. The value of this step and principle is life-changing, but it can be difficult. Today we're going to unpack the value of that and put some skin on it. Welcome to Celebrate Recovery Official, a podcast that shares life-change stories, courage, hope, and leadership wisdom, all centered around Matthew chapter 5, where the Celebrate Recovery principles were birthed to help us face the events in our life that bring up hurt, maybe some unresolved hurt that led to some unhealthy beliefs in how we see ourselves, God, others, and our circumstances. And ultimately, what do we do with that? What's the protections, the defenses that we've developed? What we call habits, not just drugs, alcohol, and sex addiction, but perfectionism, people-pleasing, and control, all those things that come and cause havoc on our relationships toward healing and growth in our life. I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ. I struggle with drugs and alcohol and perfectionism. My name is Rodney. Good to be with you guys today. Thanks as always for sharing this podcast wherever you're listening and helping us get the word out so we can reach more people. Hey, today's topic, I was recently on the road with my dear brother, Mac Owen. He's the global director of Celebrate Recovery, and had a chance to just grab a few minutes with him. And I asked him the question around Principle 6 and just the value of making amends. And so we had a great conversation. Always love hearing the wisdom of my brother Mac, a dear friend and brother in Christ, and so we had a conversation on the road, and I wanted to share that with you now, and hope it blesses you. Well, we're here at a training conference. Where are we? We are in Lexington.
No, we're not. Elizabethtown, Kentucky.
Okay, Elizabethtown, Kentucky. I forgot where we were. So Mac and I are just sitting here, and we thought, hey, we were kind of having a conversation out there. We thought, hey, why don't we have a conversation? So this is kind of, I would probably label this as conversation with Mac. And we talked about probably 5 or 6 different topics out there, but Mac, why don't you introduce yourself and we'll jump into a conversation.
Yeah, I'm a believer in Jesus Christ, and it was my struggles with drugs and alcohol that brought me here. My name is Mac, and I'm so thankful to be here with Rodney at this training conference in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, because I remember the very first one that this church held for us about 16 years ago, and at that time they didn't even have a Celebrate Recovery at their church, but Pastor John believed in the leadership here and them wanting to start one. He said, we're going to their church to have a conference. And so now, all these years later, they're still doing conferences, their Celebrate Recovery is going strong, and they're changing the dynamic of people that come into their church because they're offering them a relationship with Jesus Christ and healing all at the same time. So, yeah, it's a fun place to be.
Love it. Well, so, man, we were talking about several things, and one of those things we started to get into was kind of one of those steps that mean a lot to you in step 8. And again, this conversation can go anywhere, which is great, but maybe we start there, just talking about the most impactful, and they're all really impactful. Principle 6. Principle 6 is evaluate all my relationships, offer forgiveness to those who have hurt me, make amends for harm I've done to others when possible, except when to do so would harm them or others. Blessed are the merciful, blessed are the peacemakers. But step 8, principle 6 resonates with your heart. What jumps out to you initially just with that?
Well, when I think about step 8, of course, I go back, my recovery days started in Alcoholics Anonymous, so I remember made direct amends to such people whenever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others, which follows right along, of course, with the beatitude that Rodney just read in Principle 6. But it's those direct amends. And when you think about recovery, at least when I think about recovery, and I think about this being my favorite step, some people might say, well, yeah, you had to, admit you were powerless. That's absolutely. That was the number one big step. I stepped out of denial. And yeah, but, that taking that inventory when you got to clean up all the trash, yeah, that was a big one too. But, then my shortcomings and having to deal with those. But it wasn't until I got to step 8 that I started really repairing relationships that I valued in my life. Now, I was doing the groundwork in all those steps before that, and they are no less important, but they are what took me to step 8. And then all of a sudden, I started building back these relationships that I had caused a lot of harm in. And so, people a lot of times ask me, as soon as we get in recovery, I was no different. As soon as I got here, I read through the steps, of course, and I saw this one. I'm like, that's where I need to start. Mm-hmm. And it's like, no, you need to start back at 1, go through all the rest of them before you start this, because you'll make a mess of them. Because I wanted to jump in and make amends immediately to everybody that I'd harmed and repair those relationships. But fortunately, I had a great sponsor that directed me and guided me in a way that said, you know what, we're going to get to every one of those. And but let's do some work on other things before we get to that point. But when I finally did get to step 8, not even that happened immediately. I started working through the amends I needed to make, but the biggest amend that I ever had to make didn't happen until about 9 years into my recovery. And I didn't even realize it was there. Mary and I had given up a son for adoption when we were 15 and 16 years old. Mary and I, my wife, later got married. But we gave that son up for adoption, and I never told my mom and dad about that. And so here I am in recovery, and about between 8 and 9 years later, I started thinking about, I owe my mom and dad an amends out of that, because I cut them out of a relationship that they could never have with a grandson because of my behavior. And I thought, wow. First of all, I'm glad I didn't realize that when I first got into recovery, because that would have been pretty devastating for me, and I probably wouldn't have handled it good if I went to them. But I'll never forget the night I went to their house. Me and Mary went, and I just said, Mom and Dad, hey, would y'all fix me a meal tonight? And they're like, yeah, come on over. Sort of, a little bit suspicious about what's he got up his sleeve. And so I'll never forget going to their house. We had supper. I was nervous, man. I did not want to tell them. Mary was with me. She assured me it was the right thing to do. And my sponsor also told me it was the right thing to do. And so I took the advice of good, godly people and decided to go ahead with it. And so I just laid out to my mom and dad, look, I was 15 years old. Mary was 16. We had a son. We gave up for adoption. And my mom and dad just sat there real quietly, and I'm trying to explain it the best I could. They weren't responding at all. So I'm like, this is a bad sign, After a few minutes of silence, when I finished my presentation, they both simply looked up and said, we knew. I was like, oh, my word. They knew all this time. They didn't know all the details and everything, but they had enough grace to let me come to them in my time. And I totally knew they were just going to blow up, but the exact opposite happened, and they said, we forgave you a long time ago. And I was like, wow, that was amazing to me, because I'll tell you this. Almost every amends I've made, I knew it was going to blow up on me. And to date, after 37 years in recovery, not one of the amends that I've made have blown up on me. Now, on the other side of that, there's this part about this step about accepting amends too. And sometimes I can not do that well, or just blow over somebody that comes in to make amends. Oh, it wasn't that big a deal. If somebody's coming to me to make an amends, that's a pretty big deal. And so I will say this, for years, I had a resentment against my dad, because he raised us kids really strictly. He was a good man, but he raised us really strictly, and there was no room for anybody's opinion except his. And being raised in a church that was very, very strict, there was no room for any foolishness. And so I really carried some pretty good scars from feeling like that I couldn't even make my own decisions on anything because he made everything for me. And so I really wanted him to ask me for forgiveness. And it was so neat when my sponsor, this is one of the, if you don't write anything down, write this down in just a second, because this is one of the biggest lines to me anyway that made a difference in my recovery. When I told my sponsor how upset I was that my dad had never asked for forgiveness, he simply looked at me and said, "That's his recovery, not yours." And I was like, what did he just say? He just said that was his, not mine. And so then in that moment, I came to the realization that even though my dad hadn't asked for forgiveness, I needed to forgive him. And that didn't mean letting him off the hook, or it didn't mean, it could mean if you've had somebody that's abused you, it doesn't mean having a relationship with that person later, whatever. But when I forgive somebody, it evicts them from living rent-free in my mind. And that, again, was so those two incidents, and both of them involve my parents. Interestingly enough, for me, me making amends and then being willing to forgive whether or not they ask for forgiveness or not. And that could be a whole topic in itself.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I love that. Thanks for sharing that. I think one of the things when you were talking about, it's interesting, you wanted to jump in. I also hear the other side where people are like, I don't want to do this because I know it's coming. But it sounded like you were ready and you had to be pulled back. But I think there is wisdom in that. I can't remember who said it, but it's this idea that an apology without transformation is manipulation. Am I just apologizing to manipulate you to get back into good graces, or is it out of a heart of transformation? So thank God for godly people that pull us back and say, hey, work your recovery. That's the first 5 principles, the first 7 steps of recovery before we get to this process. But I'm curious, Mac, for you, there's a tricky line that can get people hung up, and I'm curious, as you're mentoring people, there's that line in the principles, except when to do so would harm them or others. And sometimes we can use that as a permission to, well, I don't want to hurt them. So I'm gonna stay away from owning that and making amends. How do you coach men in recovery when that line comes up and they don't want to do the important step?
Yeah, except when to do so would harm them or others. That is such a powerful line, and it was not put in there as an addendum or just something extra. It really was a meaningful part of that step, I believe. I'll never forget, a guy came to me one time. He'd been married about 4 times, and he was my sponsee, and he said he was in recovery now, not married, and he said, the number one amend I've got to make is to my ex-wife. And I told him, the best amends that you'll ever make to her is never talk to her again. And he looked at me, he's like, what are you talking about? It says right here. I said, yeah, read the second part, except when to do so. I said, you going back and talking to her right now and giving amends will, first of all, just fuel the fire of why she doesn't want to be around you anymore, but also could do some hurt to her that could be eternal. And so your best move is just stay away from her. I promise you this. If there's a time when God thinks it is wise for you to make amends to her, He will make that available, and you will be like, that's what I was waiting on. But until then, I said, you make your amends to her, to me, right now, if that's what you're ready to do. And so that's what he did. And then I don't know that he ever talked to her again, but that was the best advice that I could give him at the time. Sometimes, that part of the step means not making or not talking to that person again.
Yeah, I love that, past girlfriends, that kind of thing, that have remarried and all that. It's like, it's probably not appropriate to knock on the door and say, hey, sorry, we had premarital sex. It's like, well, who are you? But yeah, I think that I wonder if you could expand on this. I'm thinking about your parents. It's risky, right? I mean, because it could bring back hurt. And there's a difference between hurt and long-term harm. And the risk and any ounce of healing or recovery does require taking a risk. And it was risky for you to go sit with your parents because it could bring up hurt, and maybe they weren't able to take it in, but you were working your side of the street. What is the difference in your mind? Love to hear your wisdom on that long-term harm versus allowing the process of hurt so that Jesus can bring healing to their heart, bring healing to your heart. Doesn't mean we avoid hurt, but you're talking about long-term harm. What I wonder if you could expand on that, Mac.
Yeah, just thinking about that, it was a risk going to my mom and dad. And so I had to, in my mind, lay out what the risks were. The risks were they would never speak to me again. They would never have a relationship with their grandson, who now by this time in our lives, we could see from talking to his birth parents that there was going to be a time that he did want to be a part of our life. And so it was going to come out one way or the other. So that was another part of the risk. If I don't tell them, they're going to hear it from somebody else. And that to me would have been way worse than whatever reaction they would have had than to just hearing it from me in the first place. And so, so I weighed those risks and then thought about what the plus was on the, I don't know if you guys do this, but to me, writing things down is like, it's paramount in my recovery because I know once I write something down, it becomes real. I'm a cabinet maker by trade, and I'll just give you a small illustration. I can be measuring a part for a cabinet, and I have to cut it out on the table saw. And if I measure that part and go to the table saw, by the time I turn the table saw on, I forget what the measurement was. But if I, at the point of measuring that, write that down on something, I don't even have to take it with me. If I just write it down right then on a piece of wood and go up to the table saw, I remember it 100% of the time. So writing things down makes it's very much paramount in my recovery because it makes things real. So when I talk about writing pros and cons down, or the pluses and minuses, when I talked about my parents, I wrote down the things that could be a negative effect, and then I went to the other side of the paper and I decided, let me write down the pluses. Well, the pluses were that they could have a relationship with their grandson, which was actually on the other side of the paper too, about them never having a relationship with him. So now all of a sudden on the plus, if I go through with this, they can have a relationship with a grandson that they didn't know, which turned out to be a fantastic thing. They gained another grandson. They loved it, but also, when I think about the effects of me being honest with somebody, for my parents, it gave them a great boost in knowing that they had raised a son who had come back to honesty. Because at this point in my life, they knew all about my drug history. They knew I'd turned my life over to Jesus, but was it really real? And so with bringing up things like now honesty in my life and saying, look, I just want to be honest with you guys. I don't want to hurt you at all, but I feel like I have hurt you because I've kept this from you. And so when you start laying out the pluses and minuses and you write those down on a piece of paper and you see what actually outweighs here, is it going to be, now I will say this, if the minus side or the con side would have been so much greater than the plus side, I would have said, no, I'm not going to do this. But they got to see an inside glimpse of a son that they had raised, that they had lost for such a long time. And now all of a sudden they're like, we didn't do such a bad job with him. He's going to be all right.
Love that. That's so good. So when you were talking, Mac, it just hit me, when we come into recovery, we're coming into recovery dealing with the effects of running away from pain. And this is coming full circle because we've been equipped. Yeah, it may hurt, it may be painful, but now we're doing it in a healthy way. That's in a healthy confrontation, is saying, hey, I did you wrong, and I need to own that. But it's this whole process is about taking responsibility and owning my side of the street and trusting and giving God an opportunity in that hurt to come and comfort. There's mourning in that, but the Beatitude says that He comforts those. He comforts us when we mourn. Great conversation. We're going to take a quick break right here. When we come back, we'll continue with Mac Owen around Principle 6. Stick with us, and we'll be right back. Hey friends, did you know that we have an online meeting every single Wednesday at noon Pacific? People from all over the world, literally all over the world, come together, men and women alike. We hear a devotional, we hear a little mini testimony, and then we break up into gender-specific groups. You can share or just listen. One thing I guarantee is you'll walk away feeling better. When we get together and we connect and we get vulnerable, it builds bonds and reminds us that we are not alone. If you'd like to join us, go to celebraterecovery.com, find the link, and join us this Wednesday at noon Pacific. Welcome back. We're talking with Mac Owen about Principle 6 and want to continue the conversation with him. Enjoy. But Mac, just chewing on the amends, if I've got a bowl of amends and I'm trying to, you're a great cook, and I've got to add all these spices and ingredients, right, to a good, healthy amends. What are the ingredients of a healthy amends in your mind? I mean, we kind of walked through some of this stuff with the lesson, but in your mind, as you're approaching, I'm thinking you sitting at the table with your parents. What are the ingredients that was important for you to have in that bowl of amends, a healthy amends? What does that look like practically?
Well, hands down, the number one ingredient would be humility, and not going in there like I am above anybody or anything or any situation, that I have only been forgiven by God's grace. And that's can be such a cliche thing to say, I'm forgiven by God's grace, but it's actually true. You know, if it wasn't for His grace and mercy, I wouldn't be here today. And so going into any amends, I think the fruit of the Spirit has got to lead the way. And when I say that, I'm talking about love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And any one of those, if you take them out of the ingredients, there's a recipe for disaster. And so starting with humility, but then going all the way through the end of the fruit of the Spirit after I look at being humble, and ending with self-control. Self-control in this list of ingredients may be not saying things that I want to say or things that I deserve to say. In other words, look, this is what I did, but as soon as I say but, you might as well just stop your amends right there, because you're going to say exactly opposite what you said. I did this, but if you wouldn't have done this to me, then that would have never had to take place. If you wouldn't have been the strict parents that you were, then I could have talked to you about this when this happened. If you would have only loved me the way I needed it, I'm like, all that is meaningless. Hear me when I say that. That's meaningless. This is about me and how I act. So if you take the fruit of the Spirit, and I really encourage you to go look at Galatians 5 and look at those fruit of the Spirit, because after he says, talks about the fruit of the Spirit, he said, here's what I want you to practice in your life. And I know this, if I practice something, it's going to be because I'm not very good at it, and I want to become better. So if I practice the fruit of the Spirit, you know what he says? He says, do all of those that you want, because against such things there is no law. He said, you can do all of that. Now the other stuff that you used to do, or you want to go into amends to make you look better, or to put this person down, whatever it is, he said, put all that aside and just do your amends, focusing on the fruit of the Spirit. So I really encourage you, go in there and dig around in Galatians 5 and look at those fruit of the Spirit. And remember, it says fruit of the Spirit, not fruits. It's not plural, it's singular. So he says, if you're following me, all these things will be evident in your life in some measure. Now, I might be better at some than others, but he said all these things need to be in your life. So when you're talking about making amends, if you would just take the fruit of the Spirit, let that be your guide. Before you make an amends, before you do your pro and con list, take that list of the Spirit, put it right before you, read through it, and then say, okay, now I'm going to list my cons and I'm going to list my pros. But it's all going to be under the direction of who I am now and the fruit that the Spirit is producing in my life today. It's not going to be the fruit of what Mac wants to have in his life, because the fruit of my life was not good fruit. But God's Spirit produces good fruit. How am I making that available for others to see today in my recovery? Because that to me is really the bedrock of all of it.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, because it is fruit of the Spirit. And I think this is another reason why we don't start with this, because fruit is not something we manufacture. It is something that comes, I am the vine, you are the branches. He is giving us every ounce of fruit. Every ounce of fruit that lives inside of us first came to us, grows in us, and then works through us. And so that's another great argument for why we need to wait in that. But I love that you brought up the buts, and I add the ifs to that. If I hurt you, Mom and Dad, well, you hurt them. So you wouldn't be making amends if you didn't. So you don't want to start with ifs. So leave the ifs and the buts out of it, so that it, that ingredients to a healthy amends is the fruit that first came to me. So I'm working in honest recovery. Rigorous honesty is a part of the recovery process, but and then that fruit that He grows in us then is practice. And it made me think, even when we become believers, we're living out our salvation, right? We've received Christ. Doesn't mean we've arrived. There's this process now of practicing what it's like to be a believer in Jesus Christ. And I think in forgiveness and amends, this is the heart of Principle 6. It is practicing forgiveness. Can I live and walk in as a forgiven child, that we've been made new, that we are new creations, etc. And then am I practicing this in my daily life, even when I blow it today, right? It's like, well, sweetheart, you're going to be so grateful when I get through my next step study and I'm going to make amends. It's like, well, there are certain things that we can immediately make right? I mean, we have a recovery process, and then the practicing is doing it on an ongoing basis. How is this process of working, I don't know how many groups you've been in now, but working these principles, specifically Step 8, Principle 6, how has that made it easier for you to own something immediately and make amends with your wife, with people close to you? What's that look like?
Yeah, it's really no coincidence that Step 10 comes after Step 8. Where we can make that take that daily inventory, and when we're wrong, promptly admit it. Once you start seeing the amends that you're making start to bear fruit themselves, and relationships start to bloom where there was just a dead vine before, that can be very addicting, and I almost hate to say that, but I really have a very addictive personality. And in other words, when I see something that I like, I want more. And so when relationships get better because of the hard work that I put into making the amends, and I see the fruit that is coming from that, I want more of that. And so for me, it's like a no-brainer. If Mary and I have a tiff, and we have said crosswords to each other, that never lasts very long, because I don't want that to be something in our relationship that I have to make a bigger amends for later. If I can make an amends today for something I've done today, that amends actually is pretty small as far as the work I have to do to make that amends. And so why not keep it smaller instead of letting it grow into... Here's what I know. If something happens to me in my life and you do something to me, or I perceive... Because a problem doesn't have to be real to be a problem. As long as it's real, if it's real or perceived, it's still a problem. But if you perceive something that I've done and I don't make amends for that, and you think it's a wrong, then in your mind, it's going to start growing and growing into something that is huge, that could cause a nuclear reaction with later. With right now, if I deal with it now, it's going to be a whole lot smaller. And you said something earlier, Rodney, that took me back to my first recovery meeting. You said rigorously honest. And when I first came to for those of you that don't know, I went to a church because I had problems in my life. I didn't know where else to go. They sent me to AA. Ironically enough, AA sent me back to the church. But when I went to AA, one of the very first things I heard in a meeting was they read this paper. It said something like, "Rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path." And then it went on to say, and this path is going to include rigorous honesty. And I'm like, I don't know what that means. I thought you were just honest or not. And now they're saying there's qualifiers to this honesty, and you need to be so honest that it's going to be a rigorous journey. In other words, it's going to be hard work for you to be this honest. But they said, if you do this, the benefits that you will reap will be almost otherworldly. And so when you say, how easy is it to make amends today quickly? Oh, are you kidding me? It is so easy today. Now, I'm not saying that sometimes I don't feel like a jerk because of the way I just acted, but it's so easy to make the amends because I don't want to feel like a jerk. And if I don't make those amends quickly, guess what? I start feeling like a bigger jerk by the moment. And so to me, it's a no-brainer. Now, I want to say this too. I said every amends that I've ever made has turned out well, and it has. I have not had one where somebody said, "No way, I'm not forgiving you." Not a one. But I realize that could happen. And if it does happen, remember this. You've made an amends in the proper way, working it through the fruit of the Spirit. And if somebody declines to give you forgiveness, that is now on them, not you. And so remember, you've done your part. It's still going to be hard, but that's why you have an accountability team. That's why you have sponsors, somebody you can go back to and talk to afterwards to say, this is what I did, to assure yourself that you took the right steps, and then realize this, that God still is proud of you for making that amends, whether it was accepted or not. Remember, though, that is on such the short list of people that I know that made amends and it didn't turn out well. Almost always people are they're either going to say, "No problem, I forgive you," or here's the one I love, "I don't know what you're talking about."
Yeah, that's my favorite. It's like I forgot about it. I didn't even know that. Wasn't even my mind. But it isn't for them, right? It's for us. But it is sad when I hear people, even in marriage relationships, they'll say, "My husband's in recovery and I've never heard him make amends for anything." And so, okay, that's probably some accountability thing there. But just to be totally transparent, even on the way here to this conference, I called my wife because last night we were talking about something with our kids and we were frustrated, and I reacted agitated. My tone wasn't great, and Holy Spirit just said, you need to make that right. And so I called my wife and said, "Hey, I was frustrated about this, but that doesn't excuse the way I talk to you, and I just need to ask for your forgiveness." So it makes me think about how, the Scripture says, "Don't cause another brother to stumble." And when we talk about the other passage that don't let the sun go down on your anger, if I do something to hurt you and don't own it, am I inflicting something on you where the sun may go down on your resentments because of my actions? So it's a very biblical practice for me to own my side. Whether you receive it or not, I need to own that so that you don't carry anything and that we can have peace as far as it depends on us, of course. But this has been great, Mac. This is awesome. I thought we might go a million different directions, but I appreciate you expanding on step 8. Any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, just one thing. You alluded to it and said, how does this affect your recovery today? And I'm glad you just shared that with you and Carol, because Rodney and Carol happen to be some of our dearest friends here on planet Earth, and we truly believe that we're going to, even though we don't get to spend as much time here on earth as we want to, we're going to live on the same street in heaven, because we want to hang out even more with him. And the fact that he owned that and then called Carol, that's exactly what I'm talking about. That proved to me everything we're talking about today. You make those big amends, and then the amends you have to make tomorrow are going to be so much easier and quicker because you can own your stuff quickly and not live in your head in that stuff and let it grow into something that God never intended for it to be in the first place. So remember, that's step 8. It's why I think it's my favorite step of all, is because it helps me live a free life today by being able to do that quickly today. So Rodney, thanks for having me on today.
Been a great conversation. Thank you guys for listening. Excited to continue this conversation. I'm sure we'll be talking about it more, but good stuff. Always get a lot out of this. Thank you guys for being with us today. Such incredible wisdom. So grateful for my brother Mac, and always love to share conversations with him. And I know I learned some things from our conversation. I hope that you did too. Just an important principle, an important step of our journey, making amends, offering forgiveness, receiving forgiveness from others. That's the heart of Principle 6, so that we can walk in that newness of life the way Christ designed. Hey, thanks so much as always for being with us. Always looking for ideas that you have for future topics. Be sure to send those in. But as always, thanks for being with us. I pray that you'll join us next time. Until then, God bless you guys.